Chapter 81. Duty. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 81. Duty. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations, Mr. Pei, you want us to help protect Lu'er. At this point, Lu Zhe understood what Pei Qian meant. He couldn't pay too much attention to Lu'er on the surface, because the refugee camp, to put it bluntly, was like a big sieve. Not only were there people from Du Yuan's side, but there was also a northern barbarian spy. No one knew if there were any more spies hiding in the dark. Therefore, in order not to expose Lu'er's identity, Pei Qian definitely couldn't contact Lu'er at all. He couldn't even send anyone over. After all, Pei Qian only trusted those few people. The movements of those people naturally represented Pei Qian's movements. However, things would be different if Lin Suisui and Lu Zhe did so. In the eyes of outsiders, those three people were familiar with Lu Zhe. This way, even if they interacted in the future, it wouldn't arouse much suspicion. But the problem was, why should they help? More importantly, why was Pei Qian so sure that they would help? The only people I can trust in this refugee camp are the two of you. As Pei Qian spoke, he raised his hand and took out a jade token from his sleeve. He placed it on the tea table near Lu Zhe. If any upheavals happen in the refugee camp, you don't have to care about anything else. Take this jade pendant and escort Lu'er back to the capital with Wu Lu and the others. There's a blacksmith shop in Luyi Alley. Go in and find the shopkeeper. Ask him if the farming tools that the North's third master Zhu had ordered have been forged. He'll tell you what to do. Someone like Pei Qian must have some hidden forces in his control. His instructions sounded like his last words. Had the situation become so serious? Why don't you just leave with Lu'er? When people encountered such things, it went without saying that they would think from their own perspective. Lin Suisui was naturally the same. She knew very well that once she accepted this mission, she and Lu Zhe would have to face two problems. Now that they had finally escaped from the capital, they had to go back. How would Lu Zhe decide? Are you planning to sacrifice yourself? Lin Suisui didn't think too much about it, but Lu Zhe had already thought of it. Once the refugee camp was in chaos, these refugees would scatter and escape. Compared to Pei Qian, they were much less of a target. Moreover, Pei Qian would definitely deal with it. It was very likely that he would set up a fake Lu'er as a target to lure attention. This was something that a lunatic like Pei Qian would do. Even ordinary people like you can imagine the consequences. Now, your hometown has suffered a disaster, and the imperial court can still settle you guys down, but if we really let the northern barbarian tribe's scheme succeed, when the war begins and people are plunged into misery and suffering, how many people will die? Pei Qian picked up the jade token and handed it to Lu Zhe. I'm not a gentleman, but I know that I'm responsible for guarding the land. There can be conflicts at home. Even if brothers kill each other, we can't risk our family business. That's the bottom line. Okay. Lu Zhe stared at Pei Qian for a long time before reaching out to take the jade token Pei Qian handed him. Without looking at it, he raised his hand and put it in his sleeve. You're quite bold. Seeing Lu Zhe take the jade pendant, Pei Qian praised him with a smile. Lin Suisui rolled her eyes. That's because we have to die if we don't agree to it today. Pei Qian's words were indeed righteous, making one's blood boil. However, after thinking about it carefully, Lin Suisui keenly realized that she and Lu Zhe had actually been threatened by him. Not to mention anything else, she and Lu Zhe had been brought here alone. If they didn't agree, this sand beach might become their burial ground. A man doesn't care about trifles. The end justifies the means. Pei Qian smiled, not feeling guilty at all. Lu Zhe stood up and wanted to bid farewell, but Pei Qian didn't let him go as easily as before. Instead, he raised his hand and stopped him. Since you're already here, I have to treat you to lunch before leaving. As Pei Qian spoke, he had already brought over the lamb that had been roast for a long time and placed it on the bonfire in front of them. Its skin had already been roasted until it was yellow. The grease had seeped into its skin and fused with the sauce outside, emitting an extremely tempting aroma. Honey. Lin Suisui sniffed slightly and identified the source of the sweet fragrance. In such a remote wilderness, there was honey to roast. How extravagant. Ha, Madame Lu's nose is really sharp. Yesterday, Qian He and the others brought people into the mountain and found a beehive. They spent a lot of effort to bring the honey back. I thought about how you ladies would probably like it, so I asked Qian He to fill a big jar in advance. You can bring it back later. Pei Qian was very generous in other aspects. Thinking about how she and Lu Zhe were risking their lives for Pei Qian, so taking a jar of honey was nothing in comparison, Lin Suisui didn't refuse and accepted it calmly. Not only did she accept the honey calmly, but something else occurred to her. Can I discuss something with you? Lin Suisui deliberated for a moment before looking at Pei Qian and asking. What? Pei Qian turned around and listened attentively. If we capture that wolf guard, can we ask a few more questions? Lin Suisui blinked as she looked at Pei Qian with longing and anticipation. That was a strange technique that her mentor had always wanted to master. Although the wolf guard only mastered a portion of it, if she could understand this portion, she could deduce the rest through other spells. But it was too difficult to find an opportunity to learn the basics. Are you still thinking about the northern barbarian's face-changing technique? As soon as Lin Suisui spoke, Pei Qian knew her plan. It was rare to see her so interested in something. However, it wasn't surprising. Since she was a doctor, it was reasonable for her to be interested in such a technique. If we really capture that wolf guard, I promise to let you question him. As for whether you can pry open his mouth and get the information you want, that will depend on your own ability. Chapter 82. Is this a cat? You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 82. Is this a cat? Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations Lin Suisui only found out after she returned that during this short period of time, more than 10 people from the Du family, including the old and the young, had already disappeared from the refugee camp with their luggage. Although everyone knew that the news of the Du family's disappearance was related to the nobles above, no one had the guts to ask in detail. Mrs. Luo only came over quietly to tell Lin Suisui about this matter. Then, as if she was afraid that others would hear her, she quickly went back. Pei Qian moved quickly. The next day, he gathered everyone in the refugee camp. The Du family's corpses, which were hanging on a rack at the side, had already given most of them a heavy blow. However, with such a deterrence, no one dared to be impudent. They lowered their heads and didn't even dare to breathe loudly. Pei Qian's method was also very simple and crude. He registered the refugees in every household and divided the entire refugee camp into teams with 3 to 5 households. There were 2 guards in charge of each team. Every time a team set off, they had to camp in one place and monitor each other. If anyone appeared abnormal, they had to report it immediately. If they found out that they had concealed it, all the team members would be punished. Every 4 hours, the guards would report the situation of the team members. Anyone who was lost or missing had to be reported immediately. They couldn't hide anything. There were more rules. Qian He stood on the stage and explained them to the refugees below. As for Pei Qian, he didn't show up. Not long after Lin Suisui and Lu Zhe returned, the officials in charge of the distribution came over. As expected, they were separated from Mrs. Luo's family and the Wu brothers. Compared to the 5 families next to them, their team had few numbers. There were not many people, so there were relatively fewer things to do. Soon, the 3 families followed Pei Qian's instructions and found a relatively remote place to settle down, avoiding the chaos in the refugee camp. Mrs. Luo's husband's surname was Fong and he was an upright person. Other than farming, he relied on building walls and houses to subsidize some household expenses. It was also because of this personality that when they had not decided to move north with the refugee camp, their family had the hardest time. His father was biased towards his eldest son, and his mother was biased towards her youngest son. Only Mr. Fong, who was simple and honest, was left in the middle. He did more work than an ox every day, but ate less than a chicken. In the end, even Mrs. Luo and the children in the family had to work for the Fong family. Regarding the northern expedition, Mrs. Luo listened to Lin Suisui and refused to take a single cent when she insisted on splitting from the family. She brought the children north because she didn't want to continue suffering in the Fong family. The Fong family had a good relationship with Lin Suisui and Lu Zhe along the way. Especially those two sons. After following Lu Zhe into the mountains once, no matter how old Lu Zhe was, they kept calling him Brother Gu. Originally, it was a little inconvenient for them to talk since they lived so far from each other. Now that their three families were tied together, they were even closer. The Hire.ups had also said that it would be best for the teams to discuss how to collect more food in the future because the weather would become colder. This way, things would be easier for them during the winter. The three families decided to cook together. Anyway, there were only 11 people in total. It was more convenient to eat together. After discussing the next arrangements, Lu Zhe and the other men set off into the mountain early the next morning. Only Mrs. Luo, her eldest daughter.in-law, Mrs. Fong, and her youngest daughter, Fong Ruier, and Lin Suisui, were left in the camp. Knowing that the weather would get colder and colder, Mrs. Luo and the others had been making winter coats. Mrs. Luo and the others tore open a blanket, then took out the cotton inside to make a jacket. They also matched it with a few animal skins. Although the coats didn't look good, they would definitely keep them warm. Lin Suisui had the winter clothes that the Sun family had prepared for her previously, so there was no need to tear open the blanket. However, if she wanted to wear them, she still had to use needles to re-sew them. Since they had nothing else to do, they gathered by the fire to sew. Little White had grown a lot and looked about the size of an adult dog. In contrast to how weak it looked when its mother had forcibly given it to Lin Suisui, not only had it grown taller, but its body had also become much stronger. Naturally, the little fellow's range of activity could no longer be restricted to the carriage. Usually, Lin Suisui and the others used linoleum to block the view outside and gave Little White a certain range of activity, but now that the three families were gathered together, Little White definitely couldn't be hidden anymore. Is this a cat? Fong Ruier was the first to discover Little White's tracks. She was young and was too bored to focus on needlework. After sitting for a while, she felt bored out of her mind. However, the refugee camp was still very chaotic now. No matter what, Mrs. Luo didn't agree to her going out to find her friends. The little girl, who was feeling a little bored, looked up and met Little White's gaze. That round, furry head and curious gaze mesmerized Fong Ruier. She didn't think too much about it and only thought that it was Lin Suisui's cat. As she asked Lin Suisui, who was sitting at the side, she reached out to touch it. Unexpectedly, the little fellow, who had been staring at her curiously and innocently, instantly changed its demeanor and bared its teeth at her. Hey, why is this little fellow so fierce? Fong Ruier hurriedly retracted her hand and stared at Little White, who was on guard against her. From the looks of it, it was a little bigger than an ordinary cat. No wonder it had such a bad temper. This doesn't look like a cat. Fong Ruier's sister.in-law, Fong Lu, looked up and followed Fong Ruier's gaze. Her first reaction was shock. It wasn't as if she hadn't had a cat before. How could there be such a big cat? This was clearly. It's a little tiger cub. Lin Suisui didn't hide it. She stood up and walked to the ox cart. Then, she reached out to stroke Little White's back and smoothed its fur. As she did so, she explained to Royer and the others in a low voice, I encountered it by chance when I was on the mountain previously. Chapter 83. Crisis. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 83. Crisis. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations. Lin Suisui didn't mention the entire process of her meeting Little White. After all, it was really a little strange and it wouldn't be good if word spread. Of course, the main reason was that Little White was a white tiger. At first, I didn't know if I could raise it. I didn't expect the little guy to be so energetic. Relying on meat soup, it actually slowly grew up. Lin Suisui had only reached out for a moment, but Little White had already squeezed into her arms through the gap in her arm. It narrowed its eyes and snored comfortably. If she didn't mention that it was a tiger, most people would only think that it was a larger cat. But it's still a tiger. After understanding Little White's identity, although Fong Royer still felt that this little white tiger looked cute, she no longer had the courage to go forward. Yes, it's still young. When it grows up, Mrs. Luo thought of the rumors that tigers ate humans and looked at Little White in panic. They looked close now, but tigers were wild and aggressive by nature. If the tiger changed after it grew up? We'll talk about it when the time comes. When it's bigger, I'll keep it if it wants to stay. If it doesn't want to, I'll find a forest to release it. Lin Suisui reached out and rubbed Little White's furry head as she answered indifferently. She had no intention of keeping Little White here to begin with. When it grew up, if it was willing to stay, she would definitely have a place for it to stay. However, if it wanted to leave, she would also want to choose a forest with Lu Zhe and send it back to nature. Everything has a spirit. You saved its life. No matter what, it definitely won't hurt you. Fong Lu smiled as she bit the thread in her hand. Then, she looked up and reassured her mother. Law, Mom, don't worry too much. Look, this little fellow seems so close to you now. The reason it bared its teeth at Roy just now was because it wasn't familiar with her, right? That's true. Even if it's a kitten, it will brandish its claws when it encounters strangers. Mrs. Luo. Fong Lu was right. She nodded and smiled. However, its fur looks different from that of ordinary tigers. It's probably still too young. When I saved it back then, it was smaller than my two palms combined. When it's a little bigger, its fur might become darker. Lin Suisui smiled and simply brought the topic to an end. After the initial shock, Fong Royer still couldn't help but want to touch its smooth fur. However, no matter if she approached Little White carefully or tried to entice it with meat, she was rejected by Little White. Sometimes, the more you couldn't have something, the more you wanted it. This saying applied everywhere. Fong Royer had been focused on Little White for the past 2 days. She didn't even have the time to go out and play with her friends. However, there was no progress. Little White still bared its teeth and ran away when it saw her. It didn't want to be with her at all. Fong Royer was very depressed. She took a half-withered foxtail and sat on a big rock not far from her tent. Royer, what's wrong? The fourth daughter of the Zhu family, who was friends with Fong Royer, and a few other girls came over with baskets filled with wild vegetables. When they saw Fong Royer sitting on the rock in a daze, they couldn't help but ask her curiously. Nothing. Fong shook her head, clearly not wanting to say more. What's wrong? Did your mother scold you again? You haven't been out with us for the past few days. Li Er even asked about you yesterday. The Zhu family's fourth daughter refused to give up. She climbed up the rock Fong Royer was sitting on in a few steps and continued to ask excitedly. The group of girls also chimed in. They kept asking Fong Royer questions. It was as if they wouldn't stop until she answered. I'm really fine. I was just thinking of a way. Fong Royer was annoyed. She said impatiently, you guys can't help. Go back quickly. Seriously, if there's anything, just say it. There are so many of us, and there's strength in numbers. Hurry up and tell us what trouble you're in. It would have been better if Fong Ruier had not spoken. As soon as she did, these young ladies became even more curious and concerned. They pestered her even more. Fong Ruier finally couldn't hold it in anymore and told them about seeing Little White at Lin Suisui's place. Such a rare thing naturally fascinated the women. Wow, are you serious? A real tiger? You're not lying to us. That's right, don't tell me you're mistaken. The women's eyes widened. After a series of exclamations of disbelief, they pushed their luck even more. Ruier, show us. That's right. We've never seen what a tiger looks like. Is it any different from a cat? That's a stupid question. How can a tiger be the same as a cat? After the women finished arguing, Miss Zhu, who was beside Fong Ruier, tugged at Fong Ruier, who looked troubled and regretful. Why don't you bring us to take a look? Otherwise, we won't be able to give you any ideas. Can't we just go over quietly and not alarm anyone? Fong Ruier actually regretted telling them about Little White immediately after, but since she had said it, the current situation wasn't up to her to decide anymore. Fong Ruier, who was blushing, was pushed around for a long time. Finally, she gritted her teeth and pushed away Miss Zhu, who was almost hanging on to her. She quickly slid down from the stone and squeezed through the crowd to run towards her tent. Wait for me. I'll ask my mother first. As she watched Fong Ruier run away quickly, a trace of disappointment flashed across Miss Zhu's face. However, she quickly composed herself and smiled awkwardly at the young ladies around her as she sighed and said, Ruier is always like this. Forget it. The next time we see her, we'll beg her again. What's there to beg? Didn't she say that the tiger was raised by Madame Lu? It's not like her family raised it. Can't we just look for Madame Lu? Before Miss Zhu could finish speaking, a young woman beside her interrupted her. She spoke rudely and matter-of-factly. This matter-of-factness quickly infected the surrounding women. The group of little girls was at the age where they were fearless, so they rushed towards Lin Suisui's place. Chapter 84. Punishment. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 84. Punishment. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations, kneel over there. After hearing Fong Ruier's incoherent explanation, Mrs. Luo raised her hand and pointed at the empty space at the side. Mother, my sister didn't do it on purpose this time. Why don't you punish her with something else this time? Although Fong Lu also felt that Fong Ruier's actions were very inappropriate, Fong Ruier was a young girl after all. Mrs. Luo wanted to punish her so severely in front of outsiders. It was too embarrassing. A little girl like her might not be able to withstand it. Punish her with something else. Will she remember if I punish her with something else? Mrs. Luo glanced at Fong Ruier, whose eyes were red. She had no intention of compromising. Didn't we instruct her before this? But look, did she listen? I've told her to think about the consequences before doing anything, but what about her? When has she ever listened to my advice? Is this the first time I've instructed her not to tell anyone about Little White, or the first time you've reminded her? How much trouble has there been in the refugee camp? What if the news that Lun Yang is raising a tiger spreads? What trouble would it bring? Didn't I tell her previously? But look, it had only been a few days, and she has already forgotten about it. Since speaking to her nicely doesn't make her learn her lesson, I'll use another method. This time, making her kneel will only let her suffer embarrassment. It's better than her causing trouble and losing her life next time. Just think about it. How did the Du family get into trouble? Mrs. Luo didn't intend to spoil Fong Ruier. On the first day they discovered Little White, both Lin Suisui and her mother had reminded her more than once to keep news about Little White as secret as possible. What was the situation outside now? If things went wrong, people would die. This girl had agreed to it at that time, but she forgot about it right after. How many times have I told you that Miss Zhu is too scheming? You're too honest, so don't get too close to her. If you have anything to say to her, it's best to just say it. But what about you? Did you listen? Since she had said this, Mrs. Luo didn't intend to end things just like that. She stared at Feng Ruier, who was kneeling on the ground with tears flowing down her face. Her eyes were filled with disappointment. She's most likely the one who instigated this matter, right? Don't blame me for being ruthless. It's time for you to learn your lesson. Today, I'll let you kneel in this li and think about it carefully. If you do it again in the future, kneel outside. Mother, I was wrong. I really know I was wrong. This was the first time Feng Ruier had seen her mother speak to her so sternly. Moreover, it was the first time her mother had punished her so mercilessly. She held it in for a long time, but in the end, she couldn't help but cry out. However, at this moment, Mrs. Luo was determined to teach her a lesson. Naturally, she ignored Feng Ruier, who was crying beside her. She stood up and walked to the ox cart. Then, she said to Lin Suisui, who had hidden inside the ox cart when Mrs. Luo started to punish Feng Ruier, I didn't teach my daughter well. My indulgence caused her to make such a mistake. Please forgive us. If anything happens in the future because of this matter, our entire family is willing to do our best to remedy it. Mrs. Luo could naturally understand what Feng Ruier had not thought of. Raising a tiger in the refugee camp was a big deal. What they were most afraid of was that someone would try to cause trouble. Their team was divided so easily. Actually, many people had been envious of them for a long time. Fortunately, Lun Yang had always been careful, and Gu Erlang wasn't easily swayed. Therefore, although many people had been envious of the couple for a long time, it was really difficult to find fault with them. If it was really used as leverage this time. Even if it wasn't a big deal, it was more or less disgusting to have people take advantage of them. You're too polite. Ruier didn't mean to do it, Lin Suisui said to Mrs. Luo very politely through the curtain. She responded to her apology but didn't plead for Feng Ruier. She could hear clearly through the curtain that she wasn't the only one who had mentioned these instructions. Mrs. Luo and the others probably mentioned them too. But Feng Ruier didn't listen. Or rather, she didn't take it seriously. To put it nicely, she was naive. To put it bluntly, she didn't think before she spoke. In a peaceful era, such mistakes might be harmless, but in this politically unstable period, her innocence might really cost someone their life. She's still young. Teach her well. She definitely won't do it again in the future. We've all been a child once. After we make mistakes and suffer because of them, we naturally understand what we can and can't do. Lin Suisui lifted the curtain and moved out of the carriage with a smile. She looked at Mrs. Luo calmly and sincerely as she said, "Don't be too angry. Everyone makes mistakes sometimes." Mrs. Luo was about to say something when she saw Lin Suisui suddenly raise a finger to her lips. She quickly shut her mouth. Not long after, she heard a flurry of footsteps approaching. Excited and anxious voices quickly sounded outside. Madame Lu, I heard from Ruier that you have a tiger cub here. Is that true? Madame Lu, we've never seen what a tiger looks like. Can we see it too? That's right. This is such a novel thing. We just want to see it to broaden our horizons. The women outside were chattering non-stop. Although they were excited, no one dared to lift the curtain and enter. Lin Suisui and Mrs. Luo looked at each other. Mrs. Luo looked apologetic and was so ashamed that she wanted to hide. Lin Suisui, on the other hand, looked calm. She reached out and patted Mrs. Luo's hand gently to comfort her. Then, she turned to the group of young ladies outside the curtain and said, "You guys actually took her joke seriously. At this moment, we can barely fill our stomachs. How can we have the ability to raise a tiger? A few days ago, when I entered the mountain, my husband accidentally encountered an injured mountain cat, so he brought it back for me to keep as a companion. However, this mountain cat was indeed a wild animal. It ran away in less than 2 days after recovering. Why do you think Royer was so sad and depressed? It was because the lynx ran away. Chapter 85. Auspicious. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 85. Auspicious Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations, do you mean that Royer lied to us? But Royer isn't such a person. Lin Suisui could deceive the others, but this wasn't the first day that Miss Zhu and Fang Royer had met. She knew Fang Royer's personality very well. Naturally, she questioned him. Royer was just joking with you. I also know that this joke has gone too far. I'm punishing her. Lin Suisui didn't speak, but Mrs. Luo lifted the curtain that blocked their view and revealed Fang Royer, who was kneeling in the corner. Don't worry. After she's punished, I'll get her to go door by door to apologize to all of you. You girls have known her for so long. This matter is Royer's fault. As her mother, I'll apologize to you girls on her behalf. Please forgive her for joking this time. Don't be like this. How can we accept that? If my mother finds out, she'll beat me to death. That's right. Since it's a joke, we'll leave first. Another day, we'll call Royer out to dig for wild vegetables. Although the girls were lively and mischievous, they were still young. They had never seen such a scene before. They immediately bowed to Mrs. Luo and left. Miss Zhu was left standing there alone. It was extremely awkward. Miss, go back first. I'm afraid Royer won't be free today. She'll go over and talk to you guys tomorrow. Mrs. Luo smiled at her and politely asked her to leave. Miss Zhu turned around and took 2 steps. Then, she hesitated for a moment before stopping and looking back at Mrs. Luo as she whispered, Royer didn't do it on purpose. It's just a joke. We've been friends for so long, so we won't blame her. Can you spare her this time? It's so cold. It's too uncomfortable to kneel as punishment. I'll accept your kindness on behalf of Royer. However, a mistake is a mistake. Even if you plead for her this time and forgive her, she's still in the wrong. You guys might not blame her, but our family can't indulge her. Fortunately, Madame Lu is a sensible and magnanimous person. Otherwise, wouldn't both sides suffer if you guys were tricked by her? She deserves to be punished. Good child, I know you're kind. Go back quickly. It's cold outside. As Mrs. Luo spoke, she pushed Miss Zhu towards the Zhu family. From the beginning to the end, she didn't even give Miss Zhu a chance to speak as she sent her away with a smile. After Mrs. Luo left, Fang Lu sighed and walked to Fang Royer, who was crying uncontrollably. She handed the handkerchief to her. Wipe your tears. Don't cry anymore. If you had known earlier, why did you do so? You know your mother's temper. Previously, you didn't listen to her advice and interacted with Miss Zhu in secret. She was already unhappy. This time, you made such a huge mistake again. Don't think that this matter will be over after they leave today. Let me tell you, there's probably no way to avoid trouble this time. You know what we relied on to avoid trouble along the way. If not for Gu Erlang, your father would have lost 1 leg on the mountain last time. Her mother had told them more than once to be careful and not do anything that would attract attention. But what about you? You probably didn't hear a word. Seeing that Fang Royer didn't raise her head, Fang Lu didn't persuade her further. She squatted down and helped Fang Royer wipe the tears off her face. She didn't forget to analyze the entire story to her. Previously, when the Du family came looking for trouble, you were so agitated and angry. However, in the blink of an eye, you befriended Su Sanyang. If I hadn't stopped you quickly that day, you would have told people everything about Madame Lu telling us to treat the Du sisters. You don't know what's good for you. You're always running your mouth off. Now that you've caused trouble at home, no matter what, your mother and the rest of us will think of a way to help you make up for it. But when you marry someone in the future, if you still act like this, who will clean up your mess? I really didn't think too much about it. I was pestered by them at that time, so I just blurted it out. Fong Ruier lowered her head as she knelt on the ground. She sniffed as she spoke in a low voice, as if to explain or defend herself. Sister.in.law, I really know my mistake now. I won't dare to do it again. As Fong Ruier spoke, tears rolled down her face again. She was really frightened this time, not only by her mother and sister.in.law's attitude, but also what her sister.in.law had just said. She might have caused huge trouble this time. She didn't know anything else, but the fate of more than 10 people in the Du family was still fresh in her mind. What if? Alright, kneel here and think about it. Think about what you did wrong. Fong Lu sighed. She had watched her sister.in.law grow up. If her mother hadn't been ruthless this time, she probably wouldn't have been able to punish her. However, although her heart ached, her mother made the right decision to punish her. From the beginning to the end, Lin Suisui didn't interfere with Mrs. Luo and Fong Lu's punishment for Fong Ruier. Although she had also expected that Little White would be exposed one day, she didn't expect it to be in such a hasty and chaotic situation. It's fine. I'll find a chance to tell Pei Qian tomorrow. At night, Lu Zhe listened to Lin Suisui's description of what had happened during the day. He only thought for a moment before offering a solution to reassure Lin Suisui. If there's really no other way, just say that Little White is his and you're just taking care of it for the time being. Actually, I'm not worried about anything else. It's mainly Little White's fur color. Lin Suisui sighed. Although she felt that Lu Zhe's suggestion was good, she was still a little worried. Many times, white tigers were treated as auspicious. If someone really coveted it, would she be able to protect Little White? Don't be afraid. Little White is auspicious. At least for the time being, we can protect it. As for the future, we still have at least a month's journey until we reach the northern camp safely. Who knows how many unexpected incidents there will be in this month. Lu Zhe reached out to tuck Lin Suisui in and coaxed her gently, sleep. Chapter 86. Rumors. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 86. Rumors. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations. Mrs. Luo was ruthless this time. First, she punished Fong Ruier with kneeling for most of the night. Later on, Mr. Fong really couldn't bear to see it anymore and pulled Fong Ruier, who had been kneeling until her knees were bruised and her legs were almost numb, back to the tent. Early the next morning, Mrs. Luo dragged Fong Ruier out to apologize to everyone. After all the trouble, the previously bubbly Fong Ruier now looked dejected and sullen. She had indeed been ruthless, but afterwards, her heart ached for Fong Ruier's knee. Fortunately, Fong Lu was prepared. While Mrs. Luo brought Fong Ruier out to apologize, she came to look for Lin Suisui. Lin Suisui told them that this kind of bruise had to be rubbed with medicine to recover quickly. There was definitely no medicinal oil now, but there was still some wine left. Lin Suisui handed the remaining yellow wine to Fong Lu and asked her to boil it with ginger. After it was applied on Fong Ruier's bruises, it would heal in a few days. Fong Ruier's screams almost alarmed the entire refugee camp. However, when she thought of how Mrs. Luo had apologized to them one by one in the morning with a straight face, they weren't stupid enough to come over to investigate. However, Mrs. Luo still didn't dare to be negligent. As she rubbed Fong Ruier's legs, she gave her a lot of instructions. Fong Ruier was in excruciating pain. At this moment, due to the pain, she remembered the instructions deeply. I won't dare to do it again. The next time I see Miss Zhu, I'll take a detour. Mother, I was wrong. Please spare me. I really know my mistake now. Mrs. He was in a good mood today. Her rivalry with Mrs. Luo went a long way back. The two of them had known each other since they were young. Their two villages were separated by a single river, so they saw each other often. Coupled with the fact that they were about the same age, they naturally became the subject of comparison. As time passed, the two of them naturally began to butt heads because of various things. Especially after the two of them got married. Mrs. Luo gave birth to 2 sons in a row, and even gave birth to 2 daughters. From then on, Mrs. He's mother-in-law started to give her a hard at home, and her relatives also criticized her. When they mentioned her, they inevitably praised Mrs. Luo at the same time. Why? This grudge had never subsided even after so many years. In the past, Mrs. Luo had always been arrogant in front of her. When had she ever brought her daughter over to apologize to her? Just thinking about it made her feel happy. Miss Chu sat beside her mother and looked at how excited her mother was today. After hesitating for a moment, she couldn't help but tell her mother the truth. Is what you're saying true? At first, when she heard Miss Chu mention it, Mrs. He didn't pay much attention. After all, in her opinion, it was fine as long as she could cause trouble for Mrs. Luo. As for what happened between them, it wasn't important. However, after hearing what Miss Chu said, her attention was immediately attracted. You're saying that Madame Lu raised a tiger. Did Feng Ruier tell you this? I knew it. Feng Luo had always been stubborn. If it was really just a joke, she would at most reprimand her daughter. There's no need to go through such lengths. She even personally brought Feng Ruier to apologize door by door. In my opinion, she did it for Madame Lu to see. Mother, do you mean that Madame Lu is really raising a tiger? Although Miss Chu already had some guesses, it was best if her idea could obtain her mother's support. It's most likely true. Mrs. He nodded as she said firmly, in fact, there must be something we don't know. Otherwise, they wouldn't have offended Madame Lu so badly and made the Feng family suffer so much humiliation to salvage the situation. When Miss Chu heard her mother's words, she became excited. I think so too. Originally, I wanted to go over and take a look, but Madame Lu and Mrs. Luo blocked my way. I couldn't get close. There's no hurry. Even if we can't go, there are many other people who can. There are troubles in our refugee camp every day. Everyone is on tenterhooks. What do you think others will think if word gets out that Madame Lu has a tiger by her side? And what will the higher-ups think? Mrs. He was very smug. She leaned close to Miss Chu's ear and whispered something to her. Then, she sneered smugly, didn't their families always say that they were as close as family? I want to see if they can still stay close this time. News of Lin Suisui raising a tiger quickly spread in the refugee camp. This kind of rumor could easily be exaggerated. The more it spread, the more exaggerated the story became. Soon, things got out of hand. In fact, there were even strange rumors about the tiger being a demon. Of course, Lin Suisui knew that the rumors about her had already spread like wildfire. She didn't think much of it and just waited to see what else would happen. Although Lin Suisui was indifferent, Feng Ruier couldn't stay calm any longer. Her previous mistake had already made her feel guilty. Now that this rumor had spread from the Zhu family, it was like a slap in the face. Her mother was right about every worry. It was all her fault. She was too stupid. How could she believe that Mrs. He's daughter, who had always been at odds with her mother, wanted to be friends with her? No, I have to go ask her. Why is she spreading lies? Feng Ruier stood up angrily and wanted to rush out, but her sister-in-law, Feng Lu, pulled her back to the bonfire. Calm down first. What's the use of rushing out like this? Weren't you the one who revealed news of Little White previously? So many people heard it. She just told others about it. What is she lying about? Chapter 87. Protection. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 87. Protection. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations, but didn't my mother tell them that I was joking with them? Fong Ruier was a little puzzled. She did tell them, but later on, her mother punished her. Shouldn't they believe in her mother instead of her? Do you think those who want to cause trouble care about the truth? Mrs. Luo walked in with a straight face as she scoffed at Fong Ruier's dissatisfaction. Stay at home and work for the next 2 days. Don't go out and run around. Isn't there enough trouble? It wasn't only Fong Ruier. Mrs. Luo, Lin Suisui, and the others were the same. Basically, after Lu Zhe and the others entered the mountain during the day, the women stayed at home to work. No matter what outsiders said, they did not show up. Mrs. He clearly wanted to cause trouble for Lin Suisui and Mrs. Luo's family. However, after stirring up trouble for 2 days, she was a little annoyed to discover that no matter how bad the rumors became, those 2 families still seemed unaffected. She became filled with anger. After enduring it for a while, Mrs. He decided not to tolerate it anymore. That afternoon, she gathered a few women who were very familiar with her. There were also a bunch of women who might not be able to help, but would at least watch the drama. They rushed over to look for Lin Sui, Mrs. Luo, and the others. I also heard from Miss Chu that Madame Lu raised a tiger. Raising a tiger is dangerous. A tiger isn't an animal that can be raised domestically. Miss Chu said that Ruier had told her that the tiger had almost bitten her a few times. If the tiger even bit the people around it, what if it ran out in the future and bit us? Madame Lu, you can't be so selfish. You only care about your own happiness and make the people around you, like us, worry about our safety every day. As soon as Mrs. He came over, she went straight to the point. We've discussed it and feel that no matter what, you shouldn't let that tiger stay in the refugee camp anymore. Otherwise, wouldn't we helpless women be at risk of losing our lives at any time? As soon as Mrs. He finished speaking, the others naturally expressed agreement. Some even cruelly suggested that Lin Suisui hand Little White over for them to beat to death to prevent future trouble. Madame Lu, don't blame us for being straightforward. We really can't let this tiger live. Think about it, why was that wild thing willing to come back with you? It might lash out at any time. In that case, the bloody corpse from before might have been killed by the tiger. I think it's better for you to hand over that tiger and burn it to death quickly. After that, perhaps our refugee camp will be peaceful in the future. An old lady with white hair beside Mrs. He held a walking stick as she condemned Mrs. Luo and Lin Suisui. They even wanted to bypass Lin Suisui and Mrs. Luo and arrange for people to search for Little White to kill it. What if I don't agree to your request today? Lin Suisui sat on the shaft as she quietly looked at the aggressive women surrounding her ox cart tent. Her tone was very calm. When she picked up Little White, she had expected that this day would come. Therefore, she had always tried her best to hide Little White's whereabouts. However, Little White was still young and its health was poor. It basically slept after eating every day. It did not affect their lives at all. However, Little White had gradually grown up and could no longer fit in the basket. She really couldn't bear to confine it in the carriage like before. Therefore, after Fong Ruier spread the news about Little White, she had been waiting for this opportunity to resolve the problem in one go. This way, they wouldn't have to hide Little White when it came out in the future. If I don't agree to hand Little White over, what will you guys do? Come in and search now, then tie Little White up and burn it at the stake along with me. Lin Suisui saw Mrs. He's gleeful gaze. Without waiting for these people to reply, she questioned them. We're thinking about everyone's safety. What if the tiger you're protecting is a demon? The rumors about the tiger raised by Lin Suisui had completely spiraled out of control. Therefore, When they saw Lin Sui protecting the tiger, many people subconsciously felt that Lin Sui had been bewitched by the tiger. The group began to persuade her earnestly. The old lady standing beside Mrs. He continued to speak aggressively as her walking stick tapped on the ground, but she did not take a single step forward. "Madam Lu, we're doing this for your own good. We don't want to blow things up. If you're really unwilling, then we have no choice but to report it to Mr. Pei and let him handle this matter. You know Mr. Pei's temper. If he really finds out about this, he might really tie you to that tiger and burn you too at the stake." The more troubled Lin Sui and the others seemed, the happier Mrs. He was. She could barely suppress the gleeful smile on her face. "Madam Lu, I advise you to think carefully about whether a little beast or your life is more important. I know that you're capable and know how to treat people. But no matter what, you're Gu Erlang's wife now. Even if you don't care about yourself, you should think about your husband, right? Doesn't Mr. Pei value your husband? He assigned tasks to your husband a few times. If you insist on this matter and affect your husband's future, aren't you afraid that he will be angry?" Mrs. He seemed to be forcing Lin Sui to compromise. However, she hoped that Lin Sui wouldn't compromise. This way, she would be able to mock her even more. This girl had always been cocky and contemptuous of her. She wanted to see her get down from her high horse this time. She would also be able to hit Lin Sui when she was down. "You're spreading rumors about my wife and bringing people over to disturb her rest. Aren't you afraid that I'll be angry?" Before Mrs. He's smile could widen, she heard a cold snort from behind the crowd. Bdnvl.m. Chapter 88. Outnumbered. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 88. Outnumbered. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations. This voice was like a bolt of lightning, scaring Mrs. He out of her wits. The reason she chose to come in the afternoon was that she knew that Lu Zhe wasn't at home. If she had known that Lu Zhe would come back so early, she wouldn't have dared to come here to cause trouble. "I'm here to talk to Madame Lu." Yes, to talk. Mrs. He couldn't speak coherently. She didn't have any other intentions now. She only wanted to escape from this devil in front of her. What a joke. Others might not know, but she knew. For his wife, Gu Erlang had killed more than one person. Previously, 5 people had offended his wife. Later on, they were all beaten to death by him. "What did you come to say? You want to burn my wife to death?" Lu Zhe's expression didn't improve at all. He glared at Mrs. He, who was 3 to 4 inches shorter. He didn't intend to show any respect to this sly troublemaker who bullied the weak and feared the strong. "Are you bullying me because there was no one at home? Her husband only went out to hunt. He didn't die outside. On account of your age, I can let you off this time, but next time." At this point, Lu Zhe snorted as he raised his hand and waved the bleeding rabbit in front of Mrs. He. He warned murderously, "I'll send you to hell the way this rabbit died." Mrs. He screamed and fainted. Most of the people who came with Mrs. He were actually here to watch the drama. When facing the weak Lin Sui, they criticized her heavily and helped Mrs. He bully her. These people were struggling to survive, so they felt envious when they saw that Lin Sui had a capable husband who was favored by a noble like Mr. Pei. Why could she have such a good life? They couldn't see Lin Sui's merits, nor could they see her efforts. Their hearts were filled with hatred and malice. They wanted to slander her and ruin her reputation forever. However, these people were often the most cowardly. Despite how brazen and self-righteous they were when they came over, after being frightened by Lu Zhe, they lost their wits. In less than 10 minutes, the group of people outside had run away. Even Mrs. He, who had fainted from fright, was dragged away by a few people. They're just a group of cowards who bully the weak and fear the strong. Wu Lu came in from outside and spat disdainfully at the people outside. Lin Suisui didn't want to waste time on the group of people who came just now. She looked at Lu Zhe and said worriedly, "You guys came back early today." According to the time they usually returned from the mountain, they had indeed returned a little early today. "I'm fine. I was lucky today. I encountered 2 wild boars hunting alone." Lu Zhe handed the rabbit in his hand to Wu Lu and asked him to wash it and peel it. "This way, we won't have to worry so much tomorrow or when we get back on the road in a few days." Obviously, Lu Zhe and the others were quite satisfied with this trip. However, their gains naturally made the envy of the surrounding people rise to a new level. Yesterday, Pei Qian had already instructed someone to distribute the food Du Yuanyi had transported to each family according to the population. Adult men could only get 20 caddies of coarse grain at most. Although it was a considerable supplement for the people in the refugee camp, they still had at least a month of travel left. This amount of food was clearly not enough. The replenishment was actually very limited. Not everyone was as good at hunting as Gu Erlang and the others. Even with the soldiers guiding them, there weren't many who gained anything in the end. Therefore, Lu Zhe and the others' gains were like pouring a ladle of water into a boiling pot of oil. The entire refugee camp was in an uproar overnight because of Lu Zhe and the others' gains. The next morning, more refugees came to cause trouble. However, without exception, they all looked indignant and angry, as if Little White wasn't a tiger cub, but a monster that could devour humans. Perhaps because there were many people this time, Mrs. He, who had suffered yesterday, was clearly much more confident this time. She no longer wanted to beat Little White to death. Instead, she wanted compensation. As for the compensation, it was naturally the 2 wild boars that Lu Zhe and the others had caught yesterday. The group of people spoke at once, as if they were worried that they wouldn't have a chance. They demanded that Lin Suisui and Lu Zhe give them an explanation. "Think about the people in our refugee camp. We're all farmers. What if such a dangerous animal hurts someone? Besides, there's a huge shortage of food now. How much meat will a tiger eat? Madam Lu, didn't you always say that you're a benevolent doctor? Why aren't you thinking for everyone's sake now? How many people can the meat your tiger will consume save? It's obvious that you're just a hypocrite." Mrs. He finally found an excuse this time. Her tone was more imposing than anyone else. "What does what my family does have to do with you? Besides, I did say that I'm a benevolent doctor, but I only know how to treat patients. I'm not good at anything else." Mrs. He, if you had just told the truth and said that you just can't stand the fact that we're living a better life than you, I would have admired your honesty. But now, you're pretentiously saying that you're thinking for other people's sake. How disgusting. Lin Suisui squeezed out from behind Lu Zhe and stared at Mrs. He with a mocking expression. Not only did she retort to Mrs. He, but she also didn't forget to retaliate and warn the surrounding people who were waiting to take a share of the pie. "I also know the reason you guys came here today is that Mrs. He told you that as long as everyone targets us together, the 2 of us will be outnumbered. But don't forget, we've survived all sorts of ordeals. When we haven't we defeated the strong despite being outnumbered." Chapter 89. I'm a Buddhist, but I'm not a pushover. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 89. I'm a Buddhist, but I'm not a pushover. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations, do you think that we can't do anything to you guys now that we're outnumbered? People always have to plan for the future. I'm a vindictive person with a good memory. I'll remember all of you who came today. In the future, there will be times when some of you become alone or fall ill. Lin Suisui looked up and smiled at the crowd in front of her. She was very satisfied to see that many of them had the intention to retreat, so she didn't mind giving them another warning at this moment. "Do you want me to help you in the future, or do you want me to kick you when you're down?" Lin Suisui rarely sounded so stern. This last threat made many people in the crowd suddenly remember that during a crisis back then, Madame Lu had ruthlessly stabbed someone with a hairpin without even batting an eye. If she really took revenge because of today's incident, then many people who weren't that determined to begin with finally came to their senses from the excitement of being able to get a share of the pie. They smiled awkwardly and left in a hurry. At least half of the crowd had dispersed. Most of the remaining people didn't dare to move forward anymore. Although most of them didn't leave, they kept a safe distance from Mrs. He, who was at the front. Seeing how they all seemed like fence-sitters, Mrs. Luo, who was standing at the side, burst out laughing as she said mercilessly, "If I were you guys, I would retreat a little more. Otherwise, if a fight really breaks out later, blood will splash and dirty your clothes. That would be awful. Madame Lu, aren't your words a little too arrogant and vicious? Everyone says that every man for himself. We're just ordinary people who don't want such a dangerous animal living beside us. If you're unwilling to give food to others, we won't force you. But you can't continue to raise this tiger in this camp, right? What if someone dies?" Mrs. He's sister-in-law was standing beside her. Others could turn around and leave, but not her. The Zhu family had not split up yet, so the four brothers were still living under the same roof. If she didn't help Mrs. He today, she would be blamed and scolded when she returned. Besides, she didn't think that Mrs. He was wrong. No one would let go of an opportunity to reap benefits so easily. After all, Lin Suesue's family had hunted 2 wild boars yesterday. Even if she only gave them a small portion this time, things would be much better for them in the next few days. "I'm a Buddhist, but I'm not a pushover. There's no need to waste your breath here. Little White is still a cub. It's not strong enough to hurt you all. I explained this to your sister-in-law as soon as she came over yesterday. Besides, am I very familiar with you guys? Why should I give away what my husband hunted to save you guys? Are you all that useless and shameless?" Lin Suisui knew what Zhu Huang was thinking. All of this was just an excuse for them to take advantage of them. When dealing with such people, she couldn't be soft-hearted or compromise at all. Because if she relented even just a little, they would push their luck. "I realized that no matter what, the area beside your family's tent is always the most troublesome place in the refugee camp." Just as Zhu Huang was about to refute, a chuckle suddenly came from behind her. Pei Qian walked over slowly with his hands behind his back. His tone sounded teasing, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Do I need your permission to ask Madame Lu to help take care of my beloved pet?" The news that Lin Suisui had a tiger had actually been delivered to Pei Qian by Qian He yesterday. However, Pei Qian didn't pay much attention to it at first. In his opinion, this was a simple matter. Madame Lu often went into the mountain to pick herbs, so she might have encountered a cub that had been abandoned on the mountain. Out of compassion, she brought it back to raise. What was the big deal? Gu Erlang was very capable. Even if that tiger cub was difficult to raise, it wasn't impossible for Gu Erlang to hunt enough game to feed it. They didn't eat or snatch other people's food. Was there a need to be so aggressive and make such a big deal over a tiger cub? However, this matter blew up today. After hearing Qian He's report, Pei Qian was amused. He wanted to come over and watch the drama, which really exceeded his expectations. "Mr. Pei, you're being too reckless. Although these refugees were a little too aggressive, their worries aren't unreasonable. Tigers eat people. Doviko, if this tiger really hurts someone, the consequences will not be something ordinary people can bear." Du Yuanyi had been following Pei Qian very closely these past few days. He was very clingy. There was quite a big commotion to begin with, and coupled with Pei Qian's arrival, Du Yuanyi definitely wouldn't let himself get left behind. He had been insistent on causing trouble for Pei Qian recently. During the past 2 days, the subordinates who were escorting the refugees north had also noticed that as long as it was Pei Qian's suggestion, regardless of whether it was right or wrong, Du Yuanyi would definitely object. Even though every time he objected, Pei Qian rejected him bluntly, Du Yuanyi was determined to go against him. This time was no exception. As soon as Pei Qian spoke, Du Yuanyi immediately refuted Pei Qian's words. Do you mean that I'm an ordinary person? Pei Qian turned around and stared at Du Yuanyi with a faint smile. Of course, Mr. Pei is not an ordinary person. However, even if you're a noble, as the saying goes, no one is above the law. As an important minister of the imperial court, you should naturally set an example and not ignore the country's laws. Although these refugees are commoners, they're all citizens of the empire. If you hurt the innocent because of your selfishness, I believe His Majesty will not let you off. Du Yuanyi smiled. Under Pei Qian's oppressive gaze, he was still able to remain calm and composed. He didn't give up any chance to win people's hearts. Mr. Du, you're wrong. Mr. Pei didn't entrust Little White to me for personal reasons. As Lin Suisui spoke, Lu Zhe had already brought Little White out of the ox cart. Lin Suisui squatted down slightly and raised her hand to rub Little White's fluffy head. Then, she looked up at the shocked Du Yuanyi and explained with a bright smile, this white tiger is a rare auspicious beast. Are you sure you want to burn it to death? Chapter 90. What a joke. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 90. What a joke. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations. Du Yuanyi's expression turned ugly. He was already at a disadvantage when he arrived at the refugee camp. If he wanted to seize even a little control of this refugee camp that Pei Qian was ruling over with an iron fist, he had to resort to every conceivable means. However, it was obvious that this wasn't an easy task. Therefore, he had been doing everything he could during this period of time, like an ignorant fool. Even so, he had no choice but to grit his teeth and persevere. After all, if they didn't think of a way to fight for a seat at the table, the Du family would probably suffer at the hands of the third prince. Although they were the third prince's family, his father was right. The royal family's affairs were always more important than their family's matters. The crown prince's whereabouts were unknown, but the king refused to give the decree. It was said that Empress Dowager had hired more than 10 imperial physicians because of this matter. However, the king still didn't leak any news. Because the king had been sick, he took a leave of absence from the imperial court for half a month. There weren't many princes in the harem, but other than the crown prince, the third prince was the most popular. The Du family wasn't his only backer. There was also the Empress Dowager and the Lu family. Now, the third prince and the third princess consort had a harmonious relationship, but there wasn't even a live.in servant. The third princess consort's surname was Lu. If the Du family failed this time, the third prince would probably lean towards the Lu family even more in the future. To be honest, although his aunt was the third prince's biological mother, in reality. So what if she was his biological mother? This eagerness made him lose his composure when he met Pei Qian this time. This filled him with regret. At this moment, Du Yuanyi seemed to have been enlightened and calmed down. The anxiety and urgency on his face instantly vanished. I'm sorry. I was too careless. Du Yuanyi turned around and bowed to Pei Qian. Then, he turned around again and apologized to Lin Suisui and the others before leaving without looking back. Du Yuanyi's departure surprised many people present. Pei Qian didn't show much surprise. Instead, he walked to Lu Zhe's side happily and looked down at the little fellow, who was clearly on guard against him. He bowed with a smile. It seems that it's well fed. At least, I don't have to worry too much for the time being. After saying that, Pei Qian turned around. The smile on his face was still there, and his tone was filled with joy. However, to Mrs. He and the others, who were on tenterhooks, he said, 10 whips per person will do, since we still have to travel tomorrow. When Mrs. He came back to her senses and heard this, her pupils dilated. Before she could cry out in surprise, her mouth was quickly covered by her sister. In law. It was only 10 whips now. If her sister-in-law caused trouble again, perhaps they really wouldn't have to be whipped anymore. They might get hung instead. Pei Qian left, and Qian He stayed behind to carry out his instructions faithfully. All of the passers-by who had yet to run were dragged to the empty space at the side. One by one, they were whipped. Compared to others, Mrs. He, who had gone for wool and came home shorn, received much harsher treatment. BL.net It was because she caused this matter. Not only did she not fulfill her promise to the others, but instead, they were beaten up because of her. Those who were beaten naturally didn't dare to cause trouble for Pei Qian, so the Zhu family became the target of the public's anger. Looking at the mess on the ground, old Madame Lin was furious. She spat at Mrs. He, who couldn't do anything right, and punished her with kneeling. The chaos outside didn't affect the small area covered by the linoleum. Pei Qian hadn't just come over to punish Mrs. He and the others. He also revealed, they were setting off tomorrow. Compared to the other teams in the refugee camp, their team could move about most freely. There were 2 ox carts. At this moment, the 3 families gathered to discuss the arrangements for the journey tomorrow. What was important was the meat they had hoarded would help them survive the next period of time. I heard that there's a big town not far away. Mr. Fong knocked on his tobacco pouch and said in a low voice, if we rest in that town, we can get some more necessities. He had previously discussed with his son that he still had some spare money, so they should buy another ox cart. Although the 3 women could also sit in Madame Lu's ox cart as they traveled, with more and more luggage, it wasn't a long-term solution. We definitely need to replenish some food. Wu Lu glanced at Lu Zhe, who was silent, and suggested, also, it's best to get some warm clothes to ward off the cold. Otherwise, I'm afraid we won't be able to bear the cold if we continue north. Wu Lu said it vaguely, but Lin Suisui could tell that he wasn't talking to her and Lu Zhe, but to the Fong family. We plan to see if we can buy an ox cart when we reach the town. Mr. Fong nodded. He could tell that Wu Lu was actually trying to persuade them. We definitely have to replenish food and cotton clothes as well. The cold wind outside feels like knives on our faces. If it snows, we'll probably freeze to death. The 3 families chatted for a while and discussed what to pay attention to along the way. Seeing that it was getting late, everyone went back to rest. After Lin Suisui returned to the ox cart, she couldn't fall asleep. She tossed and turned for a long time. In the end, she couldn't help but tug at the corner of Lu Zhe's shirt. Are you asleep? It's fine. Du Yuanyi is focused on Pei Qian now. The cold northern wind was blowing outside. Lu Zhe turned around and reached out to pat Lin Suisui's back as he comforted her softly, to the outside world, Little White belongs to Pei Qian now. Even if Du Yuanyi wants to do anything to us, he has to first suppress Pei Qian's influence in the refugee camp. If he can't do it, he'll only become a joke in the refugee camp.